The man who knew the road too well. The vibration started before sunrise, not in the steering wheel, not in the engine, beneath the ground itself. Martin Reyes felt it through the soles of his boots as he stepped out of his truck and into the cold darkness of the parking lot. For a moment he stood still. The truck stop sat beside Highway 47, the main freight route cutting through the mountains. Around him, diesel engines hummed like distant generators. Air brakes hissed. Headlights drifted through patches of fog that clung low to the asphalt. Everything looked normal, yet something felt wrong. Martin glanced toward the mountains. The peaks were hidden behind thick storm clouds. Rain had fallen most of the night, and more was coming. The weather report on his radio had mentioned flooding concerns farther north, but nothing serious enough to stop traffic. At least not yet. He pulled the zipper of his faded work jacket higher against the cold and walked toward the diner attached to the truck stop. Inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon wrapped around him immediately. Most of the tables were occupied by drivers waiting for the storm to ease. Martin recognized several faces. Few recognized him. That suited him fine. He took his usual seat by the window. The waitress, Sandra, appeared with a coffee pot before he even asked. "Morning, Marty." "Morning." She poured his coffee. "You heading through the pass today?" Martin nodded. "If it stays open." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "They expecting trouble?" Martin stared through the window. Across the parking lot, rainwater flowed along the curb, not quickly, not slowly. Wrong. The water kept changing direction, cutting sideways across the pavement before disappearing into drains. He couldn't explain why it bothered him, only that it did. "Maybe," he said quietly. Sandra followed his gaze. "You always get that look before bad weather." Martin forced a small smile. "Guess I'm getting old." But the truth was more complicated. For 20 years, Highway 47 had been part of his life. He knew its curves, its weak spots, the places where fog settled first, the places where black ice formed before dawn, the stretches where heavy rain collected beneath the pavement. Some drivers followed GPS. Martin followed memory. And memory was rarely wrong. A burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table. 3 younger drivers sat there, scrolling through their phones. One of them noticed Martin looking. "Hey, Reyes." Martin nodded politely. The young man grinned. "You still carrying those paper maps?" The others laughed. Martin shrugged. "Sometimes. Man, you're the last guy in America doing that." More laughter. None of it was cruel. Not exactly. Just the kind of casual dismissal older workers learned to live with. The conversation moved on without him. Martin returned his attention to the window. A loaded logging truck rolled into the lot. As it crossed the entrance, Martin noticed something else. The truck bounced unusually hard. Not because of speed, because the pavement underneath shifted slightly, just enough to catch his eye. His stomach tightened. He set down his coffee. Sandra noticed. "What is it?" Martin didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure. That was the problem. Experience rarely arrived as certainty. Most of the time it arrived as discomfort, a feeling, a collection of details that didn't fit together yet. The vibration, the drainage, the movement beneath heavy loads, tiny things easy to dismiss individually, harder to ignore together. An hour later, dawn began to brighten the horizon. Martin walked back to his truck. Rain tapped steadily against the cab as he climbed inside. The dashboard clock read 5:42 a.m. His dispatch schedule was already tight. Any delay would cost money. He knew that. Still, instead of pulling onto the highway, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Reyes." Static crackled. "Go ahead. You hearing anything unusual from maintenance crews up near the pass?" A pause. "No, why?" Martin hesitated. How was he supposed to explain it? He didn't have evidence, only instincts. "Just checking." "You worried about the weather?" "Maybe." The dispatcher laughed lightly. "Marty, if we shut down every time rain hit those mountains, nobody would deliver anything." Martin forced a smile despite himself. Fair point. The call ended, but the uneasiness remained. He started the engine. The truck rumbled to life beneath him. For several minutes he simply sat there, watching, thinking, listening. Across the lot, drivers began leaving one by one. Headlights merged onto the highway. Trailers disappeared into the gray morning. Schedules moved forward. Deadlines waited. The world kept going. Eventually, Martin released the parking brake. His truck rolled toward the exit. Rain streaked across the windshield. The wipers swept rhythmically back and forth. 20 miles later, the mountains rose around him. The road narrowed. Trees crowded the shoulders. Fog drifted between dark ridges. Traffic remained steady. Freight haulers, construction vehicles, commuters, a school bus. Martin noticed the bus immediately. Yellow paint stood out against the gray landscape. Children's silhouettes were visible through the side windows. The sight stirred something familiar. For a moment, he remembered another morning years earlier. Another storm. Another mountain road. Another feeling he had ignored. The memory vanished as quickly as it arrived. His hands tightened slightly on the wheel. Ahead, the highway curved around a steep hillside. Rainwater poured down exposed rock faces. Small streams crossed drainage channels beside the road. Everything appeared routine. Then he saw it. A concrete support column beneath an elevated section of roadway. At first glance, nothing unusual. At second glance, everything. Martin eased off the accelerator. The base of the column looked different. Not broken, not cracked. Shifted. Only by a few inches. Maybe less. Most drivers would never notice. Most people weren't looking for it. But Martin's eyes locked onto it instantly. Years of hauling freight had taught him how structures settled, how weight moved, how damage began. The column shouldn't look like that. His pulse quickened. A pickup truck passed him, then another. Nobody slowed. Nobody seemed concerned. The school bus continued ahead. Its taillights glowed faintly through the rain. Martin reached for the radio again, then stopped. What would he say? That something felt wrong? That a support column looked different? That his instincts were bothering him? The words sounded weak even in his own head. The bus disappeared around the next curve. Rain intensified. Wind pushed against the side of the trailer. For several seconds, Martin sat in silence with one hand gripping the wheel and the other hovering near the radio. The old scar on his forearm began to ache. It always did when memories surfaced. And now they were returning. Not fully, just fragments. Screaming brakes, twisted steel, rain, the smell of diesel fuel. Faces he still remembered. Faces he wished he could forget. Martin swallowed hard. Something was wrong. He couldn't prove it. He couldn't explain it. But he knew it. And for the first time that morning, the possibility entered his mind that this storm might become something far worse than a difficult drive. Ahead, hidden by fog and rain, the mountain waited, and so did whatever was happening beneath it. The minutes nobody sees, rain hammered the windshield hard enough to blur the world into shifting shades of gray. Martin kept his speed steady. Not fast, not slow, careful. The support column disappeared behind him as the highway wound deeper into the mountains, but he couldn't shake the image from his mind. Something about it had been wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious. The kind of wrong that only revealed itself after years of paying attention. The kind that most people never noticed until it was too late. His radio crackled with routine traffic chatter, drivers discussing delivery times, fuel prices, weather forecasts. Nobody sounded concerned. Nobody knew what he had seen. For several miles, Martin argued with himself. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe the storm was stirring up old memories. Maybe age had turned caution into suspicion. He hated uncertainty. It reminded him too much of the day that had changed everything. The memory surfaced again, not as a complete picture, just pieces. A rain-soaked road, a warning sign he had noticed, a decision not to speak up, the belief that someone else would handle it. Someone more qualified, someone with authority, someone whose job it was to worry. By the time the collapse happened, those assumptions had become permanent regrets. Martin blinked the memory away and reached for the radio. This time he didn't stop. Highway Maintenance Dispatch, this is commercial carrier M417 requesting a status check. Static. Then a voice. Go ahead. Martin took a breath. I'm seeing possible movement around one of the elevated support structures near mile marker 78. A pause followed, long enough to make him regret calling. What kind of movement? Not sure. Another pause. You observed actual structural damage? No. Visible cracks? Not exactly. The voice remained professional, but Martin could hear the skepticism underneath. Sir, we're monitoring multiple weather events this morning. If you observe an emergency, call emergency services. The line went quiet. The conversation was over. Martin set the radio down. His jaw tightened. He couldn't blame them. He wouldn't shut down a major freight corridor based on a feeling either. Still, frustration lingered, because he knew something they didn't. Most disasters didn't announce themselves with certainty. They whispered first. The challenge was recognizing the whisper. A flashing set of headlights appeared in his mirror. A younger driver pulled alongside in a blue freight rig. Martin recognized him immediately. Evan Carter, the same driver who had joked about paper maps at the truck stop. Evan grinned through the side window and gave him a playful salute. Martin managed a small wave. Then Evan accelerated ahead, confident, relaxed, young enough to believe bad things happened somewhere else. Martin remembered being that age. Highways had seemed permanent, indestructible. He had learned otherwise. The rain intensified again. Water streamed down exposed rock faces lining the road. Drainage channels overflowed. Mud stained the runoff a dark brown color. Martin watched the hillsides carefully. Something else bothered him now. The water. Not how much there was, how fast it was moving. Years of storms had trained his eye. The mountain was shedding water too aggressively. The soil looked saturated, heavy, unstable. His radio buzzed again. This time it was Carl, a road maintenance supervisor Martin had known for nearly 15 years. Carl here. Heard you were making friends with dispatch. Word travels fast. What's got you worried? Unlike the others, Carl wasn't dismissive. He understood the value of experience. Martin explained what he'd seen. The support column, the drainage patterns, the shifting pavement. Carl listened without interruption. Finally, he spoke. You know something? What? We've been getting odd sensor readings overnight. Martin's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What kind of readings? Ground movement. A cold feeling spread through his chest. Carl continued. Nothing severe enough to trigger automatic closure, but enough to get attention. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence. Then Carl asked quietly, How bad does your gut say it is? Martin stared through the windshield. A school bus remained visible several vehicles ahead. Cars moved steadily between them. Families, workers, people trying to reach ordinary destinations. I don't know, Martin admitted, but I don't like it. Carl exhaled. That's what I was afraid you'd say. The call ended. For the first time all morning, Martin felt less alone. But the feeling brought little comfort, because now there was evidence. Not enough, but some, and evidence meant responsibility. The road curved sharply around a canyon wall. Below, a river churned with muddy floodwater. Logs and debris raced downstream. The storm wasn't easing. It was building. Martin noticed flashing amber lights ahead. A maintenance crew had stopped near the shoulder. Workers stood beside monitoring equipment. Even from a distance, they looked tense. One worker pointed toward the hillside. Another spoke urgently into a radio. Martin slowed slightly. Something had changed. The mountain was beginning to show its hand. A mile later, traffic came to a brief crawl. Nothing major, just enough to create uncertainty. Drivers glanced around. Brake lights glowed red through the rain. The school bus slowed too. Then traffic resumed. The delay lasted less than 2 minutes. Most people immediately forgot it. Martin didn't. Small disruptions mattered. They were clues. The highway felt different now. Tighter. Less predictable. As though everyone was moving through a space that no longer wanted to hold them. The realization brought back the full memory at last. Years ago. The collapse. He had been younger then. 38. Driving north through another storm. He remembered noticing erosion near a bridge support. Remembered thinking someone should report it. Remembered convincing himself that engineers surely already knew. Hours later, the structure failed. Several vehicles went down. 3 drivers never came home. Investigators found no fault with Martin. No responsibility. No negligence. Yet every year afterward he replayed the moment. Not because he had caused the tragedy. Because he had stayed silent. The guilt had settled into his life like permanent weather, a scar nobody else could see. Rain lashed the windshield harder. Martin blinked away the memory. Not this time. If he was wrong, he would live with embarrassment. If he stayed quiet and was right, he couldn't finish the thought. His radio came alive again. Carl's voice sounded different now, more urgent. Marty, I'm here. You need to hear this. Martin's stomach tightened. We just received updated readings. How bad? Static crackled. Then Carl answered. Worse than before. The words landed heavily. What are they saying? Another pause. Martin could hear voices in the background. Radios, equipment alarms, controlled chaos. Finally Carl spoke. We're recommending temporary closure. Martin looked through the rain toward the long line of vehicles ahead. The school bus, the freight trucks, the commuters. Everyone's still moving toward danger without knowing it. Will they approve it? Martin asked. I don't know. That answer was worse than no answer. Because time was becoming the enemy. Not weather, not traffic. The weight of being right. The first collapse wasn't loud. That was what Martin remembered most. People imagined disasters arriving with explosions and thunder. Reality was different. The mountain made a sound like a deep breath, a low groan that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the road itself. Then the ground shifted. Ahead, several hundred yards beyond a sweeping curve, a section of hillside slumped downward. Trees tilted. Mud poured across the shoulder. Traffic slowed instantly. Brake lights ignited through the rain like a chain of red sparks. Martin's pulse surged. This was it. Not a possibility anymore. Not a bad feeling. Not an instinct. Reality. He grabbed the radio. All vehicles approaching mile 79. Slow down now. Repeat. Slow down immediately. Static answered. Then voices. Confused. Questioning. Concerned. Drivers began warning one another. Words spread faster than official notifications ever could. Martin eased his truck onto the shoulder and climbed out. Cold rain struck his face. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and broken earth. That smell brought another realization. The mountain wasn't finished, not even close. The initial slide was only the beginning. A maintenance truck arrived from the opposite direction. 2 workers jumped out. Martin recognized one of them immediately. Carl. Both men met near the guardrail. Neither wasted time. You saw it? Carl asked. Martin nodded. More's coming. Carl looked toward the hillside. His expression said he agreed. Emergency vehicles were already being dispatched, but everyone knew the same truth. They wouldn't arrive instantly. Until then, the people already here would have to manage. The school bus sat trapped among dozens of vehicles farther ahead. Rain continued pouring. Visibility worsened. The highway had become a bottleneck, a vulnerable one. Then another sound rolled through the canyon, louder this time. The earth moved again, farther up the slope. A section of saturated hillside broke free. Mud, rocks, and debris surged downward. The flow smashed through roadside barriers before speeding across multiple lanes. Drivers began abandoning vehicles. Some ran, others simply stared. The scene wasn't panic. Not yet. It was confusion. The dangerous stage before panic. Martin knew what happened next if nobody took control. People would make decisions based on fear instead of information. He climbed onto the step rail of his truck. Listen up. His voice barely carried through the storm. Several drivers turned, then more. Move away from the hillside, he shouted. Stay near the inside barriers. Don't spread out. The instructions weren't dramatic. They were practical. And practical was exactly what frightened people needed. Movement began. Small groups relocated. Drivers helped one another. The maintenance crew joined in. Order slowly replaced confusion. Then, Martin spotted something that made his stomach drop. A blue freight truck, half buried near the edge of the slide zone. The cab door hung open. He knew that truck. Evan, the young driver from the truck stop. The one who had laughed about paper maps. The one who had sped past him earlier. Martin started moving before he fully thought about it. Rain soaked through his jacket immediately. Mud sucked at his boots. Martin! But Martin was already crossing the damaged roadway. The truck sat at an angle, one side sinking. The ground beneath it looked unstable, dangerously unstable. Evan, Martin shouted. No answer. He climbed closer. The mud shifted beneath his feet. A crack split through the pavement nearby. The mountain groaned again. Then he heard it. A voice, weak, inside the cab. Martin reached the truck. Evan sat pinned awkwardly against the steering wheel, conscious, terrified. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow. I can't get the door open, Evan said. His voice shook. Martin examined the frame. The impact had twisted it. Not badly, but enough. Together they shoved. The metal resisted. Then moved. A few inches. Then more. Finally the door opened. Martin helped Evan climb free. The younger man stumbled, nearly fell. Martin caught him. For a brief moment they stood in the rain together. Neither spoke. The mountain spoke for them, Another crack echoed across the slope. "Move," Martin said. That was enough. They started back. Fast. A section of roadway collapsed behind them seconds later. Concrete disappeared into mud. The sound chased them all the way to safety. When they reached the others, nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. Real emergencies rarely looked like movies. People were too busy working, helping, assessing injuries, sharing equipment, checking on strangers. Hours passed. The storm slowly weakened. Emergency crews eventually reached the area, then state engineers, then rescue teams. The highway closure became official. News helicopters appeared near sunset. By then, Martin was sitting on the bumper of his truck, exhausted. Mud covered his clothes. His hands shook slightly from adrenaline and fatigue. Across the road, paramedics checked Evan. The younger driver seemed physically fine, just bruised. Eventually, Evan walked over. The rain had finally stopped. Clouds drifted apart above the mountains. For a few seconds, he simply stood there, awkward, unsure. Then he spoke. "I should have listened." Martin looked out toward the damaged hillside. "You didn't know." "You did." The words hung between them. Neither man rushed to fill the silence. Finally, Evan sat beside him. "You really saw it coming?" Martin thought about the question, about all the years behind it, the mistakes, the memories, the guilt. "No," he said. "I just paid attention." The answer seemed to surprise Evan. Maybe because it wasn't heroic. It wasn't meant to be. The truth rarely was. Darkness arrived slowly. Floodlights illuminated the damaged highway. Heavy machinery began clearing debris. The immediate danger had passed. The long recovery would come next. Several weeks later, traffic resumed along a temporary route. Most of the country forgot about the disaster within days. News cycles moved on. Other stories replaced it. That was how life worked. But some things changed quietly. One cold morning before sunrise, Martin pulled into the same truck stop where the story had begun. The storm was gone. The mountains stood clear against the horizon. Inside the diner, Sandra poured him coffee without asking. "Back to normal?" she asked. Martin smiled. Something like that. He sat by the window, watching trucks come and go. The familiar rhythm felt comforting. For a while, nobody bothered him. Then a shadow appeared beside the table. Martin looked up. Evan stood there holding a coffee mug. "You mind if I sit?" Martin gestured toward the empty chair. The younger driver sat down. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just human. Finally, Evan pulled a folded highway map from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. Martin stared at it, then laughed, a genuine laugh, the first one in quite some time. "I figured," Evan said, smiling. "You might show me how you read these things." Outside the window, a convoy of freight trucks rolled toward the mountains. Their headlights stretched across the dawn like a river of light. Martin watched them disappear into the distance. Years ago, he had carried memories of the lives he couldn't save. For a long time, that burden had defined him. Now something else remained. Not pride, not recognition, something quieter. The knowledge that when the moment came, he had finally chosen to speak. And someone had listened. As the sun climbed above the peaks, Martin unfolded the map between them. Two drivers leaned over the worn paper, one sharing experience, the other learning to see. And beyond the diner window, the highway continued north through the mountains, scarred, repaired, and moving forward, just like the people who traveled it. Chapter 4: What the Road Remembers. Winter arrived early that year. Snow dusted the upper ridges long before sunrise, turning the mountains into pale silhouettes against the dark sky. Martin Reyes was already awake. He always was. Even after 4 decades on the road, his body still followed the same routine. Coffee before dawn, weather report, vehicle inspection, then miles of asphalt stretching toward whatever destination waited beyond the horizon. Some habits survived everything. The temporary highway route had been operating for nearly 3 months. Construction crews continued repairing the damaged section farther north. Every driver passing through the area could still see the scars: fresh concrete, exposed steel, retaining walls under construction. The mountain looked different now, as though it had revealed something about itself and couldn't entirely hide it again. Martin parked at a small overlook near the construction zone and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled clean, sharp, snow mixed with pine. Far below, excavators crawled across the damaged slope like insects, rebuilding a nest after a storm. He watched for several minutes, not because he had to, because something kept pulling him back. The disaster was over, yet part of him remained there, among the broken concrete and mud, among the memories. A pickup truck pulled into the overlook behind him. The driver climbed out carrying a clipboard. Middle-aged, heavy jacket, engineering company logo. The man noticed Martin watching the construction. Quite a mess, wasn't it? Martin nodded. The engineer joined him near the railing. We've been studying this slope for months. Martin glanced over. Find anything? The engineer laughed quietly. More than we wanted. For a while they watched the crews below. Then the engineer said something unexpected. The warning signs were there. Martin remained silent. The man continued. Water pressure, soil movement, foundation stress. He shook his head. Nobody noticed the full picture. Martin looked back toward the mountain. He understood exactly what the engineer meant. Most failures weren't caused by a single mistake. They emerged from dozens of small details that seemed harmless on their own. The challenge was connecting them. The engineer eventually returned to his truck. Before leaving, he paused. You were Martin Reyes, right? Martin looked surprised. The man smiled. Some of the workers talk about you. Without waiting for a response, he climbed into the pickup and drove away. Martin stood alone again. The words lingered. Some of the workers talk about you. It felt strange. His entire career had passed mostly unnoticed. Now complete strangers knew his name. Not because he wanted them to, because circumstances had forced him into a story larger than himself. The attention still made him uncomfortable. A week later, he experienced it again, this time at a fuel station. He was topping off his tanks when a woman approached, late 30s, construction supervisor by the look of her equipment vest. You drove through the collapse zone, didn't you? Martin sighed inwardly. There it was again, the story, following him. Something like that. The woman smiled. My husband was one of the paramedics. Martin waited. He said the truck drivers kept everything organized before emergency crews arrived. She hesitated. He said people would have gotten hurt if nobody had stepped up. Martin didn't know what to say. Compliments always felt awkward, especially when they involved events he would rather forget. The woman seemed to sense it. She nodded politely and returned to her vehicle. No dramatic conversation, no heroic speech, just another person carrying a small piece of the same memory. The road had a way of connecting people like that. Over the following months, life gradually returned to normal, or something close to normal. Freight schedules remained demanding. Weather remained unpredictable. Engines still broke down. Deliveries still ran late. The ordinary challenges of working life continued. Yet Martin noticed one subtle difference. Drivers listened more carefully, not just to him, to each other. Reports of unusual road conditions increased. Maintenance crews received more calls. People paid attention. The change wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines, but it was real. One afternoon, while waiting at a loading terminal, Martin overheard two young drivers discussing a route through the mountains. One of them mentioned unstable drainage near a hillside. The other immediately reported it through company channels. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. Martin did, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it mattered. Because years ago he would have remained silent. Now others weren't. The thought stayed with him throughout the day. Spring arrived, then summer. Construction finally ended. The rebuilt highway officially reopened. Traffic flowed normally once again. News stations covered the event briefly. Politicians gave speeches. Engineers discussed safety improvements. Then everyone moved on. Everyone except the people who had been there. One evening near sunset, Martin found himself driving the rebuilt section for the first time. The sky glowed orange behind the mountains. Fresh pavement stretched ahead. New guardrails lined the shoulders. Everything looked stronger, safer, yet familiar. As he approached the area where the collapse had happened, he eased off the accelerator. Not intentionally. The truck simply seemed to slow on its own. Old habits, old memories. The repaired support columns stood firmly against the hillside, massive, reinforced, built to endure. Martin passed them quietly. No ceremony, no audience, just another truck moving through another mile of highway. Yet emotion caught him unexpectedly. Not fear, not sadness, something gentler, acceptance. For years he had carried guilt that never truly belonged to him. Then he carried responsibility that did. Now, at last, both burdens felt lighter. The sun dipped below the ridgeline. Long shadows stretched across the road. Ahead, dozens of vehicles moved through the mountains. Families, workers, students, drivers, people living ordinary lives. Most would never know how close disaster had come. Most would never know how many small decisions had prevented something worse. That was fine. Roads weren't built for recognition. They were built for movement, for continuation, for tomorrow. Martin stopped at a scenic turnout overlooking the valley. The same place he had visited months earlier. The mountains looked peaceful now, almost innocent. He leaned against the hood of his truck and watched the last light fade from the sky. Far below, headlights began appearing along the highway, one after another, a steady stream moving through the darkness. Martin smiled. The road remembered more than people realized. Not through monuments, not through plaques, but through lessons carried forward. A driver checking a hillside, a mechanic noticing a strange vibration, a dispatcher taking an unusual call seriously. Small things, the things that mattered, the things that saved lives. As night settled across the mountains, Martin climbed back into his truck. The engine rumbled to life. Another delivery waited, another destination, another stretch of highway disappearing into the distance. He shifted into gear and pulled away. And somewhere behind him, beneath layers of concrete, stone, and repaired earth, the mountain remained silent, for now. But Martin knew something he hadn't fully understood before. The goal was never to predict every disaster. The goal was simply to pay attention, to notice, to speak, to listen. And sometimes if enough people did those things together, the road carried everyone safely home.